Over the last couple of months, a fair few of you have asked me to explain my views on morality, and for even longer than that I've wanted to, but unfortunately I haven't been able. Albert Einstein once said that if you can't explain something simply, then you don't know it enough, and in acknowledgement of these words, I knew that I needed to ruminate and converse with greater minds before publicly expressing my thoughts. But finally, I believe myself to be at such a standard, and so, for what it's worth, here's my views on morality. As many of you are already aware, in the current state of moral philosophy we have three subject areas. Metaethics, which is concerned with where morality comes from and what moral terms mean. Normative ethics, which is concerned with forming standards that regulate right and wrong conduct. And applied ethics, which is concerned with specific controversial issues, such as abortion, animal rights, climate change, capital punishment and nuclear war. Now, since I'm predominantly concerned with metaethics, because that's where I see the most confusion, that's what I'm going to primarily focus on within this video. The field of metaethics itself tends to be divided into two overarching schools, objectivism and relativism, with the former positing that morality exists as a matter of fact, and the latter positing that morality exists as a matter of opinion. For example, Catholicism advocates an objective metaethic, since it posits that morality exists as a product of divine law, and as such is comparable to any scientific law, while cultural relativism advocates a relativistic metaethic, since it posits that morality is entirely a cultural construct. My view, however, is that morality is both objective and relative. That is, it exists as a matter of fact and it's relative to certain conditions. Now on the surface, because of conditioning, this might seem absurdly contradictory, but I assure you it's not. It's no more absurd than the science of health, which is a great comparison that's been utilised by the likes of Sam Harris before, because while health is rightfully acknowledged as an objective science, it's also acknowledged as a relativistic science, since facts about health are relative to species, and in some cases, individuals. Anyhow, I'm getting ahead of myself now. To back up a little, I'm going to take some advice from Voltaire and talk semantics. First off, so far as I'm concerned, words such as good, bad, right, wrong, should, shouldn't, ought, oughtn't, virtuous, evil, and indeed ethical, unethical, moral and immoral are, I would argue, utterly meaningless without a reference. They're descriptive, and without a reference, which is granted either consciously or unconsciously, they're vacuous. To demonstrate this, consider the following. Is it good or moral to punch someone in the face? In general, no, it's not. But notice that by saying in general, I just assumed a reference, that being our social contract. If I assume the reference of a boxing fight, then punching someone in the face is good. In fact, it's the right thing to do. And so my point being here is that from a foundational perspective, words such as moral and immoral are meaningless. To say that something is moral is to say that something is good, and we can't say that something is good unless we have a reference. Moving on, what's the definition of objective? Because this word, in my opinion, is the sticking point for most people when it comes to morality, and I think it's because while we've largely outgrown religion, we're yet to outgrow religious language. There are two prominent conceptions of objectivity, one that's scientific and one that's philosophical. Scientists, and many philosophers, tend to view the relationship between objectivity and subjectivity as that of fact and opinion, and thus define an objective statement as a fact that isn't affected by an individual's feelings, biases, or interpretations, and therefore can typically be verified. While other philosophers, and the religious, tend to view the relationship between objectivity and subjectivity as that of independent of a subject and dependent on a subject, and thus define an objective statement as a statement that does not depend on a subject to exist. Now both of these definitions suit their purpose, of course, but people often conflate and confuse them, and they do so especially when it comes to morality. To illustrate this, consider the following question. Is it objectively the case that you are now thinking? If your answer is yes, then that's because you're using the scientific definition of objective. It's an objective fact about human thought, and it's something that we can measure, infer, and indeed verify. But if you were using the philosophical definition, your answer would necessarily be no, because this fact depends on you, a subject, to exist. The problem, of course, is that people erroneously assert that because morality is subjective in the philosophical sense, it's also subjective in the scientific sense, when this obviously isn't the case. Anyhow, with moral semantics covered, I want to touch upon the great David Hume's is-ought guillotine. I'll dedicate an entire video to this topic upon a time, as most people, including some otherwise reputable sources, completely misunderstand the problem. But for now, here are some brief remarks. Hume famously observed that people erroneously make claims about what ought to be based entirely on what is, that they attempt, but fail, to derive prescriptive conclusions from entirely descriptive facts. For example, consider this seemingly sound argument. Premise 1. Humans typically die if they're hanged. Premise 2. Ken is a human. Therefore, we ought not to hang Ken. This looks like a valid deductive argument, but it's not. It's a non sequitur. Even with both premises being true, the conclusion doesn't logically follow. It attempts to get a prescriptive statement from descriptive facts, but it fails. Sure, humans tend to die if hanged, and Ken is indeed a human, but how exactly do these statements of fact tell us that we ought not to hang Ken? Exactly, they don't. And so Hume's lesson, so far as I can tell, is don't assume that you can draw moral conclusions directly from statements of fact, and watch out for arguments that do. It's a brilliant observation and a very useful tip, but it's not the same as saying that morality doesn't exist, or that we can't derive a valid ought, is it? So how then can we derive a valid ought? Well, it's actually very easy. It's by having a valid deductive argument that includes at least one ought. Or in other words, it's by getting an ought from an ought. For example, premise 1, we ought to live consistently with our evolution. This is an ought. Premise 2, humans evolved to eat meat. This is an is. Therefore, we ought to eat meat. To put this in the language of mathematical logic, this argument is valid, since its conclusion does indeed follow from its premises, and it's objectively verifiable, especially given recent advancements in scientific tools. But it's not necessarily sound, because most people don't believe that we ought to live consistently with our evolution. And so my point being here is that we can deduce a valid ought, but whether we find it to be sound is dependent on if we personally accept the premises. And this, finally, brings me to what is the most unique aspect of my moral perspective. I'm convinced that there are two types of oughts, or goods, or shoulds, or morals, etc., and I currently refer to them as axiomatic oughts and contingent oughts. Axiomatic oughts are feelings of obligation that exist self-evidently, and they do so without proof or argument. They just are. They're facts of nature. An example is my current conviction that I ought to survive. I didn't reason myself into this ought, I just have it. It's an axiomatic fact of nature, not an assumption. Now that might seem dissatisfying, but so too, at least in my opinion, are all axiomatic facts. While it's not justified, it really is the case that I have this compulsion, this ought, this impulse, this urge to behave in a certain way, and this can be objectively verified through the scientific method, and so it's a scientific fact. And what's more, thanks to Darwin, we now know precisely why I have it in the first place. Hint, no God needed. And contingent oughts are feelings of obligation that are predicated on axiomatic oughts and one or more statements of fact. And because they're predicated on statements of fact that may or may not be correct, they too may or may not be correct. To illustrate this, let's take two contingent oughts, the first being that I ought to vaccinate my child, and the second being that I ought to remove a segment of my child's genitalia. How is it that I can say that one ought or moral statement is right and that the other is wrong? Well, it's by viewing them in their entire context. Unlike axiomatic oughts, contingent oughts are, well, contingent on premises, and in both of these cases they're contingent on the same axiomatic ought, that being, I ought to prevent my child from suffering, and at least one statement of fact, or is statement. And so, syllogistically, the first argument goes as follows. Premise 1, I ought to prevent my child from suffering. Premise 2, it is the case that vaccinating my child will reduce her chances of suffering. Therefore, I ought to vaccinate my child. And the second argument goes, Premise 1, I ought to prevent my child from suffering. Premise 2, it is the case that removing a segment of my child's genitalia will reduce her chances of suffering. Therefore, I ought to remove a segment of my child's genitalia. Now, both of these arguments are valid, as their conclusions follow from their premises, but only one of them is sound. And so the reason I can say that the vaccine or is correct, or sound, and that the circumcision or is incorrect, or unsound, is because it is indeed scientifically, objectively the case, given the current conditions, that vaccinating a child will reduce their chances of suffering, and it is not objectively the case, given the current conditions, that removing a segment of a child's genitalia will reduce their chances of suffering. Thus, the former is right because its premises are correct, and the latter is wrong because its second premise is incorrect. Now again, we can quarrel about the axiomatic or, but here's the thing. If you already accept it, for whatever reason, or, let's face it, lack thereof, then for all intent and purposes, what's the problem? Nature has made it so that we are born with axiomatic oughts, and while, again, this is intellectually dissatisfying, we just have to get on with it. As inconvenient as it might be, we are not born with a blank slate, and all moral discourse must, finally, accept this brute fact. Anyhow, to sum up, I do not believe, for example, that it's always morally wrong to murder. There's no transcendent objective law that we must abide by, and I don't believe that we must do anything. But I do believe, as a matter of scientific fact, that we are born with intrinsic axiomatic values, goals, and inclinations, or in other words, axiomatic oughts, and that we construe contingent oughts in reference to these axiomatic oughts and perceived facts. And because those facts can be erroneous, so too can the contingent oughts predicated upon them. Or to put this more personally, while we all have different values and preferences, and we all believe different things, the vast majority of us have the axiomatic ought of not wanting to suffer, and consequently, we want to live in a world in which no matter who we were conceived by, no matter what genetic disposition we inherited, and no matter what environment we grew up in, we were given ample love, patience, and opportunity. And so given this mutual acceptance of what is good, let's work together to create a better future. Now, the last thing I want to say is that I'm not entirely sure on how you'll respond to my views, as so far as I can tell, they're largely unique. But what is for sure is that I'm excited to digest them. If you think that I'm right, let me know, and if you think that I'm wrong, well, you're already typing. As always, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons and those of you who have donated via PayPal. Until next time, my fellow apes, until next time.